Okay, thank you very much to everyone for coming along. What I want to do this afternoon is talk about a project that a bunch of us have been working on for a number of months now, but which really has its genesis much further back, and a lot of exploration into reusable Django apps that led to where we are now. So my name's James Tauber, and my main claim to fame in the Django community is that I went to the same high school as Russell Keith McGee. When I first started getting involved in Django 2 years ago, I saw Russ's name and thought, this has got to be the same guy. There can't be more than one Russell Keith McGee in the world. Sure enough, it was him. So I actually got to see him today for the first time in, I guess, almost 16, 17 years. Anyway, at the real heart of what I want to talk today about is this whole notion of improving the speed at which you get from an idea to the realization of that idea. One comment that often gets made about Python as a programming language is that it really reduces that distance. A lot of people say that Python, more than any other programming language that they've dealt with, reduces the time from the idea that they have to the realization of that idea. And a lot of people have found exactly the same thing with Django. In terms of having a conception of a website that you want to build and actually getting it out there. And one of the things that you often have to do to reduce that jump between idea and realization is make certain compromises. You decide to fix certain things that you're going to do and not open up to completely reinventing the wheel. In some cases, it does make sense to reinvent the wheel. I made a comment in a panel I was on with Adrian Holovardi back at PyCon 2007 that reinventing the wheel makes a lot of sense if your goal is to understand wheels better. But if, for example, you were running a taxi service, thinking about ways in which you could improve the construction of wheels might not be the best use of your time. So there's definitely a layered approach that we take in a variety of areas where we say we're going to leave the lower layers to someone else and we're going to focus on the things that really help us get from idea to realization sooner. Now that's a particular challenge for a lot of us, myself included, who are both web technologists and website creators. Because if you're working with web standards and you're interested in the way that the web works, you can often get caught up in ways of implementing protocols and better ways of doing request and response handlers and a whole bunch of the technology. And that can often distract you from focusing on getting your idea realized in terms of a website itself. And an example of that in my life, I've had a website for 12 years now. And through those 12 years, it's used a variety of different technologies, constantly updated. But up until very recently, I've pretty much done it top to bottom myself in terms of the technologies. Most recently, back in 2003, I started a project called Leonardo. It's basically a single-user, password-protected wiki and blog that has been running jtauber.com since then. But what I found, well, first of all, what started to happen as I built this whole website top to bottom, including a lot of underlying technology stuff, is that a framework started to emerge. People started to approach me about, hey, what if you use the underlying technology for something else rather than just an individual website? And so I started toying with this idea of it becoming a web framework in its own right. The problem was that I was spending all of the time on the web framework part and never really doing anything that I wanted to do in terms of improving the website. And about 18 months ago, I made the difficult decision to basically ditch all of the underlying technology stuff I'd done and switch to building it on Django. And so, in other words, I made that decision that I was going to throw out half of what Leonardo was doing, defer that to Django, and therefore make Leonardo a lot smaller. What, of course, that enables you to do is focus a lot more on the kinds of changes that you want to make at the top of the stack, the stuff that's generally a lot closer to realizing the ideas that you have. Now, this kind of layering happens all the time. There are a number of different reasons why people layer software architecturally. One obvious reason is portability. I mean, if you look just within Django, the fact that we have that separation in the ORM and can basically place our Django projects on top of different databases, move from SQLite in development and then put it on PostgreSQL in production and so on, is possible because of that layering that exists. But that's not the only reason that we layer things. For example, the layering that exists in Django where we split out particular applications, we don't do that for portability, right? You write an application for Django, you can't run it on something else. The point instead of the separation of applications in Django is to improve reusability. But what generally happens whenever you have reusability is that you gain a certain amount of efficiency because you're making compromises in the way that things get done. You're giving up a certain amount of control by deferring certain decisions to lower layers in the technology stack. It's sort of the Model T thing of being available in any color as long as it's black. So to get more into the motivation that led to what is now Pinax and the work that we've done on reusable apps in Django, I want to give another example. Back in end of 2005, start of 2006, I started working on a website that was for flashcards. I had a lot of ideas about studying the way that humans remember things, when the best optimal time to show somebody the next flashcard is, when to introduce new flashcards, and so on. And I initially built this site, again, top to bottom, built all of the infrastructure myself, and it actually looked a lot like the code that Adrian was showing at lunch today, the early stuff, hand coding a lot of the SQL stuff and the like. I eventually ported to Django, which obviously deferred to Django a ton of stuff around the persistence, around handling requests and responses, the templating language, and so on. Now, what the site currently has is the ability to announce things to users. You can sign up to the site. You can search and sort decks of cards. There's a bunch of user analytics stuff that I've added so I can see how users are using the site, how many people sign up but don't necessarily go to the next stage, and so on. And soon I'm hoping to add rating, tagging, and commenting on decks so people can talk about what decks they like. I want to add groups and the ability for people to make friendship relations, have different membership levels, potentially having a sort of freemium model where people can pay for certain services, and notifications so you get notified when say, a new deck is available in a particular topic. But if you look at this list of features, almost none of them have anything to do with flashcards, right? These are all very generic features that you can imagine being on a ton of different sites, serving a completely different domain. If, for those of you who were in James's excellent talk that preceded this around reusable apps, he made the comment that PyCon 2007 was a real watershed moment in reusable apps. It certainly was for me, because it was really at this point that I was starting to come to the realization that you could take a site like Quisition, take out all of those pieces that didn't really have anything specific to do with flashcards, and that would probably actually be 80% of the site. And then if you wanted to do a completely different site that needed the same kind of functionality around a different domain object, you could just reuse all of that functionality. And so I started talking with a bunch of like-minded people about this notion of reusable apps in Django. And I agree with James that reusable apps are really, for me, the killer feature of Django. One of the things that I thought needed to be talked about, discussed, decided upon early on was conventions for how these apps should work well together, right? If somebody is writing an application to do tagging, someone else is writing an application to do search, another person's writing an application providing feeds, it would be nice if all of these played nicely together, right? Or jammed nicely together. And so I decided to form a group. Took the name of the group from Django Reinhardt's group, the Quintet of the Hot Club of France. to basically discuss this whole notion of how to make Django apps jam well together. It started a mailing list and there was some discussion, but it never got particularly far. There were some apps that had already emerged that more and more people were starting to use, including Django tagging and Django voting, both from Jonathan Buchanan, and Django registration from James Bennett. These were sort of the archetypal examples of reusable apps at the time. But there was a whole bunch of others that I could conceive of. Around the middle of last year, I launched another site. It was a very short-lived site, just the nature of the site was such that it didn't make sense for it to be around for very long. It was a site called Potter Predictions. And what it was a site just before the 7th Harry Potter book came out. People could go onto the site and make predictions about things they thought would happen in the book, be revealed in the book. They could compare their predictions with their friends, and then when the book came out, see who predicted things more correctly. But it had a bunch of other features, sending invitations to invite people to join the site, connecting to friends so you could more easily compare your predictions to theirs, make comments on predictions, tag predictions so you could see which predictions related to Hermione versus which related to Ron and so on, as well as mass mail out to users. So I could send a mail to all of the users on the website saying, get your predictions in by this time. We had a bit of a problem that illegal copies of the book were coming out a couple of days before the official publication date, so I actually had to close down the predicting part of the site a couple of days before the book came out. It became very obvious when we scored it who had got hold of an illegal copy, because there were some extremely bizarre predictions that turned out to be correct, and there was a very strong statistical correlation in certain people's ability to get all of those obscure ones right. But again, you can see that all of these features, in fact, other than the occasional mention of the word prediction there, none of this stuff is specific to predictions. In fact, you could substitute some other word for predictions there. You can imagine another domain object that you might want to make comments on and tag and so on. And the site had even less to do with Harry Potter, really, in terms of the code. There was no Potter-specific code in these applications. And so that was just reinforcing more and more this idea that there are a ton of these features that come across again and again and again in sites that could be written just once in Django, and if done well, if done in a way that it was designed to jam nicely with other applications, it would be much quicker to build this kind of site. And again, it comes back to that whole idea, how do I more quickly get from idea to realization? So I'm spending less time recoding stuff around sending invitations, around connecting to friends and so on, and I can really just focus on the things that make one site different from another, rather than the things that are the same or very similar from one site to another. Does anyone here know what this is? No jazz musicians? Okay, this is a series of chord progressions known as rhythm changes. And it's the chord progression of a Gershwin song, I Got Rhythm. And it was used by a tremendous number of jazz musicians in particularly the bebop era, who wanted to play songs but didn't want to pay royalties to the Gershwin estate. So what they would do is they would write songs on top of the same chord progressions as popular songs of the day. So they got around the copyright problems, but had this familiar, fun input that became the basis of their songs. And the term that was used for these new songs that were built just on these well-known chords was contrafacts. And the reason I raised this is that I started to think more and more about various sites on the web and how they really were just built out of the same chord progressions, if you like, as a bunch of other sites. So you look at something like LinkedIn, or Delicious, or Flickr, or Facebook. And you can start to see the common chords that these things are all built on. You can conceive of pulling out various pieces of functionality, making them available as reusable applications, and then being able to build the website equivalent of Contrafax out of those exact same chord progressions. And so a bunch of ideas for specific reusable apps started to emerge. One of them was Django Friends, for basically managing the whole notion of asking someone to be your friend and you know, connecting with them in some way on a website. Django Notification, for simply notifying that a user that some particular event had occurred, and in particular enabling the user to have control over what particular notice types they received on via particular media. You might, for example, want to say, I want to get these types of notifications via email, I want to get these types via SMS. And you can see this functionality in a bunch of websites. I mentioned in the context of Potter Predictions that I wanted to do mass mailouts, and so I saw a need for a reusable app that would let you send out a lot of mail at once, and so I was conceiving of a reusable app called Django Mailer. And then I had this, you know, somewhat generically named Django Things idea. And the idea behind Django Things was, and still is, that there are so many cases where you have some domain object that you want to tag, you want to vote on, you want to comment on, you want to paginate listings, you want to enable listings to be ordered in different ways, you want to be able to search on it, and it really doesn't matter what those domain objects are. In Quisition, it might be flashcard decks. In Potter Predictions, it might be predictions. But it would be nice to have all of the pieces that you need written in a generic way, and so you can just plug in your domain objects and go with that. So PyCon 2008 was then sort of almost another watershed for my own involvement in Django reusable apps. I hadn't read it at the time, but I since read this quote from Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who said, "If you want to build a ship, don't drum up the men to gather wood, divide the work and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea." And looking back, this is relevant here because so much of my focus on the preceding year was how do I get people interested in building these reusable apps. There was a lot of focus just on building this app, building that app. And I realised in hindsight that there wasn't nearly as much motivation to work on a particular app as there was to actually build a real website out of these things. And so at PyCon 2008, I had this notion of building a dummy site that, if you like, did everything except the domain-specific stuff. It had sign-up and friend invites and notifications and announcements and all things like that, all the sorts of things like that, but didn't necessarily have any core application. But that would at least give you a starting point then that you could use to add in your domain functionality. Now, I kind of had an interesting diversion at one point in the middle of May. I don't know if Tony Hauber's here. Are you there? Thank you very much, sir. It was because you didn't do Google Summer of Code, I think, that Pinax came about. And here's the reason why, for those of you who don't know this story. So Google Summer of Code, where Google basically pays for students to work on open source projects. Tony knew about the Hot Club of France, the projects like Django Mailer, Django Notification, Django Friends that I was hoping to write. And he put in an application to do this as part of Google Summer of Code, which I was excited about on the one hand, to have somebody else working on it, but a little nervous on the other hand, because I was actually hoping we could get those applications written quicker than 3 months that you have for Google Summer of Code. And anyway, his application was rated 5th out of those that were sent for Django projects, and Django only had 4 slots, so he missed out. But then the student dropped out. He got in, I let him know the good news. Turns out he'd taken a job in the meantime and wasn't available for the summer. So by the middle of May, it was clear that if I wasn't going to have Tony available for writing these applications, And so I decided to start down the path of writing them myself. Now, I mentioned that I wanted to build this site that was sort of a starting point for other sites. And the name that, I didn't actually talk about this term, the name that I was going to use for this starting point for sites was tabula rasa, which is the Latin for literally a scraped tablet, sometimes translated blank slate. Right? And it was kind of somewhat of a play on words, because the idea was that what I was building was essentially going to be a not quite so blank slate that you could use as your starting point. But it was something you could take and write on. It's also kind of cute because these tabula rasa are typically reusable. You can, hence the term rasa, scrape. You could scrape off the text that had previously been written there, and you could reuse them. So there was that whole reusable notion. The problem was tabula rasa is terribly overused. Well, not necessarily overused. It's used a lot. Used a lot in a different contexts. And you type tabula rasa into a Google search, and there's not much chance that your hit's going to be anywhere near the top. So I started thinking more instead about possibly using a Greek term, and I'm actually doing my doctorate in ancient Greek linguistics, and so I have a particular interest in ancient Greek. I couldn't quite work out what the Greek equivalent to tabula rasa as a whole was, even though it was Aristotle who coined the concept. He didn't use the term blank slate. He literally just said, imagine a writing surface that has no writing on it. It was only later philosophers that coined that specific term, tabula rasa. But a modern Greek speaker, Orestes Markou, suggested pinax. And pinax is both an ancient Greek and modern Greek word that refers to a tablet. It can be a tablet that's, it can refer to a tablet that can be written on. It can refer to a tablet that has decoration put on it. It can also refer to a serving platter. In fact, in the New Testament, when it describes the head of John the Baptist being served on a platter, the word in the New Testament is pinax, but draw from that what you will. Another sense in which pinax is used is a plank of wood used to build a ship. So there are a lot of interesting connotations around this notion of a pinax. And so I decided to call the project Pinax. And I posted to my blog 10th of May this year. I'd written an app that I'd been wanting to write for a while that's basically a substitute for Django registration for cases where you don't want to require an email address, but if you do ask for an email address, you do want to verify that it is a valid email address. And so Django email confirmation is basically an application that lets you optionally ask for an email address. Users can later on add more than one email address if they like, but at any point they can get sent a verification mail, and it keeps track of which emails have been verified for a user or not. So I implemented that. I wrote the obvious things around password change and reset, login, logout, and so on, and the beginnings of a tab-style UI. Remember, the goal here was to really build a starting point for new projects and a kind of scaffolding for developing new applications. And so I wanted to do a lot of the stuff that normally a reusable app wouldn't do itself around the overall UI. So I'd kind of, if you think about it, my notion of what Pinax was and the goal of the Hot Club of France had really shifted or had been augmented from being about creating reusable apps and talking about app conventions and extending that to more being a starting point for new projects and a scaffolding for developing new applications. And on that fourth point, I mean, it's often the case, if you find a reusable Django app that you want to use, it's often not easy to get up and running, try it out immediately, because it assumes you've already got users. If it's properly written and it's not trying to do too much, it's going to assume a bunch of stuff that you've already got. And so one of the goals of Pinax initially was give a bunch of that stuff out of the box so that you could try out new apps or develop new apps in that context. And then a somewhat remarkable thing happened on Memorial Day weekend. I sat down and decided to write Django Friends, Django Notification, and Django Mailer, these three apps that Tony was going to write for Google Summer of Code. And I happened to mention this on an IRC channel that a bunch of people interested in the Hot Club of France had been hanging out on. And for whatever reason, it was just exactly the right time for those bunch of people to get involved. And so probably 5 or 6 of us ended up working over that weekend. Within the first day, we had user profile pages, gravatars, messaging between users, which was drawn from an existing third-party application called Django Messages. Brian Rosner wrote a new application called Django Announcements for sending announcements. Eric Florenzano added OpenID support, and through the work that I was doing on Django Friends, added invitations to join. And then Janis Liddell, who was also contributing to code, then started working on a German translation, and before we knew it, more and more people were adding translations. And so here's a screenshot of what it looked like after 24 hours. It's in German, just to show you that we did have the German translation, but the support that was there was, you can see the tabbed framework, an early silly attempt at a Pinax logo. By the second day, we had translations into German, Spanish, and Swedish, a new design and logo. Brian Rosner added auto-completion on the message receipt field, which was a huge sizzle factor. I'd added a basic Twitter clone. Eric Florenzano had implemented OEmbed so that you could mention URLs in tweets and it would automatically embed the media. And I'd started on the beginnings of what I was calling tribes, which were groups. There was just this incredible momentum because we were building this site that had all of these different pieces. It was just very, very easy to add new stuff to. And after the weekend, I did a quick analysis of just how much of what we ended up with was reusable code versus stuff we'd written that was very custom. And these were the figures that I came up with. So 63%, this was roughly by code, by actual number of bytes. This was sort of a DU, result of DU, but basically 63% reusable apps, 10% local apps that weren't necessarily ever going to be reusable apps, 13% templates, and so on. You can see the rest. The point being that a tremendous amount of this was reusable apps, and I don't necessarily mean third-party apps that pre-existed. That included new apps that we wrote specifically for Pinax, but actually turn out to be reusable. In the following month, we added localization into Brazilian, Portuguese, and Hebrew. Time zone localization, so you could see any date times in whatever time zone you had set in your profile. We had external blog aggregation, wikis, threaded discussions, bookmarks, delicious style with voting, ability to import contacts via vCard or from your Gmail or from Yahoo, and blogging with tags and threaded comments. And we also had 1,000 users on the demo site that we'd set up. So this turned out to be, this approach of building this demo site really did turn out to be an excellent way to motivate the development of these applications. This is what the site looked like this morning. This is the bookmarks page. You can see along the top the sorts of features that we've added since. We've now got photo support a la Flickr. We have a bunch of Flash-based arcade games that Eric Florenzano added, as well as tribes, which are sort of more informal groupings of like-minded people. We have something called projects, which are more for groups of people that are working on a set of common tasks. So there's a basic task manager, to-do list sort of functionality under there. And we also have this little application called Swaps, which lets you declare that you're willing to trade A for B and find other people that are willing to trade B for A. And most of these are available as reusable apps that don't necessarily have to sit inside Pinax. But I made a blog post at the start of July. Basically, I was realising that the demo site was starting to become a useful site in its own right. People were actually using it for their bookmarks. People were actually discussing things in the discussion forums and so on. And so I decided at that point that I needed to make a better separation between the Pinax platform, this notion of a set of reusable apps and a starting point for websites and scaffolding and so on, from what happened to just be a particular demonstration of a site that you could build with those pieces. Because a lot of people were getting confused. They were going to the demo site, referring to it as Pinax and so on. And so we conceived of a site called Cloud27, which we hope to be launching soon, a social network built on Pinax. And if you're wondering why it's Cloud27, we like this whole notion of a cloud and a place in the cloud. And I wrote a quick script to basically find out what cloud ends were available. It turns out that under 30 there were only 4. And 27 was kind of cool because it's 3 times 9, so we can argue that, you know, it's 3 times better than being on cloud 9. But besides this demo site that we'd built, it was obvious that in addition to having a collection of reusable apps and conventions for those apps and a starting point for new projects and scaffolding for developing new apps, that what was emerging was a real platform for website development. Even if you didn't necessarily want games and photos and certain things like that, if you wanted notifications and ability to connect to friends, and you wanted group-like functionality in tribes, or you wanted some notion of twittering, you could just pick those pieces and use those as the starting point of your website. And that's in fact what people started to do. A gentleman in the Netherlands launched a website called FoodCell, and what FoodCell basically does is it has a ton of nutrition information, lets you log what you're eating, how you're feeling on the day, but it's got a bunch of the Pinax functionality around connecting to friends, discussing particular topics relating to nutrition, and so on. Another site that came out at a similar time was Trail Mapping, which is for basically a community around mapping trails and logging trips, specifically for bikers, but it really is applicable for a broader range of things. So this is another example of a site that took all of the stuff that is generic and not necessarily specific to a particular domain, add a bunch of domain-specific applications, and you have a complete site. So what started to happen, obviously, for people that were involved in Pinax, was more and more things started to look like they could be written in Pinax. And we would often say whenever we came across some cool new website, it's a great site, but why the bleep didn't they just build it in Pinax? And it's that whole notion of when all you've got is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. For those of you who've seen Dr. Horrible Sing-Along blog, the hammer is my Pinax. So really what Pinax does is it changes the point at which you transfer those layerings of technology over to your projects, right? Instead of building the project directly on Django, you're basically delegating certain parts of the site that you build to Pinax, with the idea, again, that it's going to more quickly get you from idea to actual realization of that idea. Now, there's an obvious trade-off that gets made here, and it's not obvious, even though it's obvious that there is a trade-off, it's not obvious exactly where that trade-off should be. Much the same way that there are plenty of things that you would use Python for but not necessarily Django, there are plenty of things that you would use Django for but not necessarily Pinax. So from the point of view of somebody deciding whether to use Pinax, there's obviously a lot of questions around how much are you willing to delegate, what kind of things are you willing to have set in stone? Again, going back to the any colour you like as long as it's black. From the point of view of the developers of Pinax, it's a similar kind of trade-off. How much do we want to provide out of the box with Pinax? How much do we want to fix and say, if you're going to use Pinax, you have to do it this way? How much do we want to make configurable so we actually provide multiple options? You could do it this way or this way. Perhaps by a simple change of a setting in settings.py. Or how much to leave completely up to the site developer. And obviously the trade-off is that the more that Pinax provides, the quicker it is to develop a site, but a smaller set of sites that it's applicable for applying that to. And it really is early days, and it's not clear, I don't think, exactly where the line should be. We're still trying to work that out as more and more projects get built on it. So if you are interested in building a website, particularly one that has certain features that Pinax already provides, we certainly would love to hear from you about what would need to change in order for it to be useful to you and so on. So just to quickly sort of go through some of the features that we already have, I've mentioned a lot of these already. I mentioned email verification, this notion that you can specify an email address or more than one email address, and it will verify whether it's actually your email address or not. We have OpenID support that works in conjunction with the normal sign-up procedure, so you can just have OpenID, you can just register with a username and password, you can have both and authenticate with either. Obviously the password management stuff that comes with any site. Site announcements, the notification framework that I talked about, messaging between users, friend invitation, basic Twitter clone. I've talked about most of this stuff before, but this is the stuff that comes out of the box now with Pinax. So just to talk a little about how that works, how that's sort of structured. The structure of the SVN repository is that we basically have a bunch of external apps. Actually, the majority of the applications are external to Pinax itself. We have some local apps, and they fall into two categories that I'll mention in a moment. We have a bunch of libraries, and then we have the Pinax project itself. And as far as I'm aware, there's not a single reference to the project in any of the apps, the project name in any of the apps, James. So with regard to the external apps, funnily enough, every single one of them, not only the ones we wrote, but all the ones that we used from other people, every single one of them was on Google Code project hosting. And in fact, I think all of them followed the naming convention Django-something. The way that we pulled them in is via SVN externals. About half were written independently of Pinax. So they were existing third-party applications that we drew upon. There were some that we wrote ourselves, even though there were existing apps that purported to provide that functionality. And the main reason that we rejected, I'm not necessarily claiming this is the only reason we rejected stuff, so if you find a counterexample, it's probably possible to find a counterexample, but one of the main reasons we rejected certain apps was that they did more than one thing. It's the first principle that James talked about in his previous presentation. And so we had to avoid what, sort of following a jazz analogy, I was referring to as rhythm section apps, where all you're wanting to do is hire a drummer, but the whole rhythm section shows up. Right? If we're looking for a blogging application, for example, we don't want it to have its own tagging, have its own commenting, and so on. It didn't make sense to do that in the context of Pinax. So there was a lot of stuff that actually turned out not to work well, and we ended up writing some of our own stuff. Here's a list of the external apps that we use. The ones that are in bold are the ones that were written specifically in the context of Pinax. Some of the others, it's a bit hard to judge whether they were. I don't know whether Eric was planning on writing OEmbed anyway, so I didn't know whether to make that bold. But What's interesting here is that there's a bunch of stuff that is obviously a new piece of functionality that you can see in a tab on Pinax, that you could imagine, being on your website and a user using it. But there's actually a ton of underlying sort of infrastructural stuff as well. And there's things that sort of fit in the middle that provide some bit of user-visible functionality, but it's not a feature of the site as much as a sort of little utility. A good example of that's something like Django pagination or Django threaded comments, where that's not its own tab on the site, but it's actually a piece of functionality that appears all over the place when you want to paginate stuff or add threaded comments to objects. The infrastructural stuff are more things like Django command extensions, which provide some awesome management commands in addition to what Django also already has. Things like Django robots for using setting your robots.txt settings via a database. Django app plugins, which lets apps contribute to a page without the app responsible for that page necessarily knowing about those apps in advance, and a bunch of other things as well. The local apps that weren't in some external SVN repository on Google Code really fall into two categories. Some are ones that really are tied enough to at least the demo site that we were building or the starting site that we were building that I can't ever imagine them being broken off. But many were essentially incubated here and at some stage will be broken off. The ones that I've put in bold, things like AuthSub and BBAuth, which are implementations for pulling in contacts or doing authentication with Google and Yahoo, respectively, in order for Django Friends to pull in contacts. Zwitschern at the end, that was kind of a fun one. When I wrote the Twitter clone, I didn't know what to call it, and so I asked Jonas Leidl, who's German, what the German word for the sound a bird makes is. In other words, the equivalent of Twitter, and he said it was Zwitschern, so that's what I called the app. If I put that externally on Google Code, I may call it Django Tweets rather than Django Zwitschern, because I'm not sure if anyone will be able to tell what Django, well, the Germans will. I guess I shouldn't assume that Tweets is any better, because it'll, only the English speakers will understand it. And then there were a bunch of libraries that we included, and this is still there's a lot that's still subject to change, but one of the decisions that we made, at least at the start, was we wanted to make it really easy for people to get up and running out of the box, and that meant providing any libraries that were required by any of the apps. And so we actually ship with all of the libraries, which unfortunately makes for a huge checkout. But it does make it very easy to get up and running. I mean, you can literally download it, do a syncdb in the project, and fire up do a run server, and you've got all the functionality there. The only exception is PIL. It's the image library. It's the only thing that actually requires compilation that's not pure Python. Now, one of the things that there are a number of issues that we encountered doing this, a lot of stuff we still need to sort out. One of the things is this whole notion of how we handle optional applications. And we have a bunch of this all over the place. I want to change the way we do it, but this is the way we're doing it at the moment. So we have this reusable app called Django Notifications, and what any other app in the system can do is it can define a series of notification types, and then it can send notifications to the notification subsystem, and the notification subsystem will then pass on those notifications in a variety of different media to the users, and the users can decide what they want to receive via what media, as I mentioned before. So, for example, the Django Friends can define a notice type that for when a friend accepts your invitation. And so when a friend accepts your invitation, Django Friends tells the notification subsystem, there's been a friendship accept notification, and if the user has elected to be told about this, it'll get passed on. The problem is that ties friendship to notification. And we'll still have to work out whether it's possible to get around this using signals, but what we're doing at the moment is basically a lot of this kind of stuff where we look to see if notification exists, and if it fails to import, it won't use it. The problem with this is you could have it lying somewhere on your Python path and have absolutely nothing to do with the website you're actually building. So a much better approach that we'll probably switch to fairly soon, unless we can work out whether this is possible via signals, is to actually look on installed apps. So if notification is in installed apps, then send notifications, otherwise don't. Another issue, I haven't got a slide for this, but another challenge that we're going to have to face is how to best handle things like CSS in the context of these reusable apps. Particularly because what you really need is a level of indirection where, for consistency, you may want to use a particular color everywhere. How do you, like, a particular application might say, I want to use this CSS class for this particular object, and another application says I want to use this CSS class for this particular this particular div or whatever, but you really want those to be the same color. Until CSS variables come in, it's not clear how best to do that. One possibility is generating CSS via templates and then creating a static version of those that then get served up. But probably the biggest challenge that we had over the last month was we made the decision to track trunk. And we did that because we wanted to be part of the reason that people upgraded to 1.0, not one of the reasons people didn't have to. And so that's pretty much most of what the last month was spent doing. Was every day it was kind of, uh-oh, this is broken now, we fix it. Next day, something else is broken. So I'm very excited now that that 1.0 is out. So in terms of where things are going, this is sort of my view of the overall stack. I've separated here out Django from Django Contrib because I think there's a lot of interesting ways of thinking about Django Contrib as sort of being the first line of reusable apps to which you then add something like Pinax to provide a bunch of others. One of the things that started to happen when we first launched Pinax was that people in different domains, different areas were interested in whether it could be applied to their area. So we'd obviously in our demo had a lot of what would typically be thought of as social networking features, but people were approaching me about whether it would be, I should say intranets actually, not internets. But I started getting approached about whether it could be used for knowledge sharing on intranets. There was a lot of interest in using it for learning management systems as well. And obviously a bunch of features that I want to add for Quisition are relevant there. And so the model as I see it is that a lot of this stuff really needs to be driven from the top. A lot of the progress that we made on Pinax was by focusing on building a particular site, the social networking site that will soon launch as Cloud 27. But then what we want to do once that's reached a certain stage of maturity is rethink the way that we did the reusable apps. But we want to do things like build some learning management system related sites, some corporate internet related sites, pull from that the reusable applications that sort of fit broadly into the categories of social networking, intranets, learning management systems. I'm certainly interested in having discussions around where something like Satchmo fits into this, because obviously that's almost a whole nother area that provides a bunch of functionality, some of which could be drawn into a more common Pinax layer. So this is the address of the Pinax project, and I certainly welcome any of you to check it out. If you have reusable applications that you're interested in contributing, we'd certainly love to talk to you. If you're building websites and think that maybe some of the features that Pinax provides would be useful to you, then we definitely want to talk to you. And certainly, you know, grab me or Brian Rosner or Eric Florenzano here at the conference. But before I open up to questions, I have one more thing. I mentioned that we've been working on this, on turning the demo site actually into a real social networking site called Cloud27. And I thought it would be cool to actually launch it live. You know, anyone can do a live demo, but real men actually launch live sites. So I'm going to have to work out how to, actually, how about I mirror this now? Okay, let's mirror the displays for this part and hope, yep, it's still 10:24. Okay. So, so this is the site now, Cloud27. I'm just going to have to SSH in. I'm using WebFaction for hosting, by the way. And if you do get a WebFaction account, please consider using Pinax as your referrer code. So first thing I'll do is I'll copy the upgrade WSGI, and which will just put up a little maintenance message. Restart Apache. Let's refresh this. Okay, so far so good. That's the easy part. Now all I need to do though is copy this WSGI. Now I warn you that most times the first time that I hit a site, I get a 502 gateway error, but that's only an initial thing, I think, caused by the Apache restarting. So let's see. Fingers crossed here. See while that's happening, it does take a long time the first time. Let's just check the load on the server. Oh, it's not too shabby. This is exciting stuff. I hope you're all as excited as I am. This is probably going to get a 502 if it's taking this long. Yep, there we go. It's okay. Don't panic. Let's try again. Well, you're the reason. So I should mention, because I haven't mentioned his name already, Greg Newman is the person that is, really deserves almost all. Justin Lilly helped out as well for the design of this. So it is, yeah, unbelievably slow. Maybe a lot of people are hitting it now, I don't know. The images are being served up statically, so we can't blame Django. There we go. So this is Cloud27. It's not the first site built on Pinax, because as we already saw, Food Cell and Trail Mapping were launched months ago. But this is certainly the most up-to-date reflection of the features that Pinax has out of the box. We've got a lot of plans, and as I mentioned, are certainly very interested in talking to you, both if you've got reusable apps that you would like to contribute, as well as websites that you would like to build using these pieces. So thank you very much. I guess we have a little bit of time for questions. Uh-oh. You want a pony, right?
Well, this got me thinking. You know, we sell Ellington as a CMS. We actually sell multiple flavors of Ellington depending on Like, say, if you're mostly like an entertainment site, okay, you get the apps that do restaurants and bars and drink specials and parties and that sort of thing. If you're a news site, okay, it's stories and obituaries and that sort of thing. Do you ever consider doing like little branded distributions of Pinax for that sort of thing?
Absolutely. I'm envisaging a social networking edition, intranet edition, a learning management system edition. Not that it's sort of orthogonal to this, but I would love to explore a Google App Engine edition. So basically go through the reusable apps and make sure that the model stuff's all recoded to run on App Engine. And an e-commerce edition, which may actually be Satchmo with a couple of, pieces provided by the rest of Pinax. Tony, you mad at me for my comments about being glad that you didn't?
Oh no,
good. Sorry, go on.
I'm glad I didn't too, because it looks really good. But I guess what I'm kind of seeing here is that it's kind of like a lot of people have this idea about Django Contrib that it should be all these like projects like this, and you guys are kind of, instead of saying Django Contrib is you're building that layer on top of that. And I think that's a really good idea. But is there like a system in place for, let's say, if somebody writes a reusable app and they want you to put it into Pinax or go through however you vet them to decide if they are worthy enough, I guess. Is there a system in place like that yet, or will there be shortly?
It's pretty ad hoc. I mean, at the moment, we're certainly not looking for duplication. So we're being very strict about, do we need this or not? There's been a lot of stuff that people have come forward and contributed that weren't necessarily what I originally envisaged would be in the first launch. I mean, the games are a good example of that, and so is the swaps. Neither of those were what I would have thought of as things that were necessarily for a social networking platform, but they were great contributions that were made. So yeah, I think it would it's going to have to be handled on a case-by-case basis. I think one of the nice things about, again, the layered approach is the criteria for getting into Django Contrib, for example, are going to be very different than getting into Pinax. And similarly, there may be additions of Pinax that it might be appropriate to include a reusable app in, but not in the core of Pinax. But that's going to be something we're going to have to work out as you all start contributing floods of reusable apps.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, Tony.
Sorry, I was a little late in, so apparently I didn't get to see my own photo. But,
it's probably a good thing.
Yeah, well.
For my sake, I mean.
Yeah. Interesting question of nomenclature. I mean, this is probably going to sound intentionally harsh. I don't want to in any way impede upon this. You've done some great work here, and it is a fantastic thing you're doing. The original sort of mandate, such that there was a mandate for Django Hot Club, was to say, what is the common ground? What is a reusable app? What do you have to do? How do you do it? Pinax, at least even the language around it, is very much you build a site in Pinax. You don't build a site with the pieces that Pinax has contributed and what have you.
I'm glad.
What essentially is the point at which we then factor back from Pinax and say, okay, this is what you have to do. These are the extra bits we need in the core. How much of this gets back to Hot Club, and what does Hot Club now look like?
Excellent question. I mean, one of the reasons why I wanted to use the term Pinax was to delineate Hot Club from the platform, and there's been a lot of confusion. I'm hoping people that watch this talk on YouTube and so on can now better understand the difference. I certainly still think there's incredible value in Hot Club notions of conventions for apps that work well together. And certainly in that case, I can imagine a lot of duplication of apps even within what could be called applications that follow the Hot Club conventions. I think we needed to get to this point to better understand a bunch of the issues, but I'm certainly hoping that we will draw out of this, a lot of those conventions, as well as potential contributions to Django Contrib as well. It really depends on where we want to draw that line that I talked about, how much we want to fix, how much we want to make flexible. The other thing I want to say, though, is you caught me quite correctly in talking about building websites on Pinax, and it's an interesting question. I've been asked a number of times of whether the right approach is to add your app to Pinax or to add apps from Pinax to your project. I think at the moment it's easier to do the former, and that's primarily because as a first step we wanted to build a whole website. So the apps aren't in their final form they would need to be in order to have an existence on their own. I certainly envisage that still probably being the preferred way of doing it, that Pinax does a lot of the surrounding stuff for user management and so on. And you could argue that you don't like the way Pinax does certain things, but that's kind of the whole point. You need to draw the line somewhere of what you're willing to delegate, and if you're not willing to delegate it, maybe Pinax isn't necessarily the best fit. Although I will say one of the cool things, of course, about Pinax being built on Django is that you really can throw out stuff if you want to and get into the guts and rewrite apps. But the other approach, sorry I'm taking a long time to answer this question, but it's a very important one. In terms of reusing the apps individually, a lot of them are already appropriate for that. Something like Django Mailer I know is being used by a bunch of people without anything else. Django Notifications, another one that's potentially useful independent of anything else. But the others I think are only going to get better in being able to be used in that way. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.